Thanks so much for joining us today for a special episode of the Q2 podcast sponsored by PanVisio. I'm joined with our guest, Nell Edgington from socialvelocity.net. Thanks so much for joining us, Nell.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Now, well, I'm excited too because based on your blog and some of the YouTube videos that I've seen, I'm just really kind of excited to pick your brain and also see what our audience members can really take away in their pursuit of social change in New Jersey or tri-state area. That's where PanVisio is based out of. But
Great.
before we go into the meat and potatoes, we always love to hear about the background of how you got started and why consulting in a sector that is pretty dynamic. You can do a lot of things, but how do you choose consulting, and why do you go in the path that you went into?
Well, I've been in the nonprofit sector my entire career. So I've worked all over the country for large and small nonprofit organizations in lots of different domain areas. And about 6 years ago, I realized that instead of being part of a single nonprofit organization, I wanted to help to create change among the sector overall. And I thought consulting was a way to do that. And I felt that I had somewhat of a unique perspective about how the nonprofit sector could move forward and how it fit into this larger emerging emphasis that I saw on social change overall in the various forms that takes. And so I launched Social Velocity a little over 6 years ago, and have been working with all different kinds of nonprofits to help them increase their efforts to create social change.
Okay, great. And so, did you transition this at all part time, then took it full time, or was that transition like for you?
I actually, right before launching Social Velocity, I worked for the local public television station here in Austin, Texas. And
Okay.
I actually gave my notice the day that Lehman Brothers imploded,
Whoa.
sort of the kickoff of the recession, which I thought was quite interesting.
Hmm.
So I took a real leap of faith. And but felt like the time was really right. There was such an emerging social entrepreneurship movement, such
Mm.
emphasis on social change. I really saw the millennial generation, really coming of age and really pushing that. And I just wanted to be part of that. So recession be damned. And
Yeah.
I sort of took that leap.
Well, you're in good company because I know like Apple and Microsoft were companies that actually started not in the greatest economic times.
Yes,
So
right.
and with the whole Neiman thing, Neiman Brothers thing crashing, it's almost like like the moral imperative. Like you want now.
Yeah,
This is even more of a reason why this has to happen and launch. So that's
absolutely.
great. That's great. Um, when it we're really focusing on a lot of very strategic yet practical solutions. I know for PanVisio, that's what we tend to do. And nonprofits, I think, are best served when it comes to the practical stuff. Theory is an important foundation, but if you can't translate that, you know, that is really all for nothing. You mentioned that you felt like you had something to offer and to give. When was that? When did that actually occur to you? Like, actually, I can do this. I do have something to offer. And what is that unique perspective that you mentioned earlier that makes social velocity a little different?
Well, I mean, I think, through the course of my career working internally at nonprofit organizations, I became increasingly frustrated by,
Mm,
what I saw as, call them inefficiencies or, just sort of traditional ways of doing things that just didn't work anymore. I think, and I talk about this a lot on my blog, and I think this is my unique perspective, is that there are elements of the nonprofit sector that are broken.
mm,
And my view is we need to reinvent the sector. It's all about social change and passion for making the world a better place, but some of the structures in which we do that are just don't work anymore. And I think fundraising is a great example of that. Nonprofit leaders sort of beat their heads against the wall trying to bring money in the door in pretty inefficient ways, and they struggle with wrangling volunteer board members,
yeah.
and sort of work amidst a structure that is really lacking in enough capital to get the job done, while these social challenges are becoming, larger, increasingly more complex, et cetera. So it's sort of a losing proposition if
Hmm.
you continue with the status quo. And so I really believe that there are better, more effective, more strategic ways to move social change forward. And that's sort of what that's what I write about. That's what I talk about. That's what I work with my clients on, is doing things in really different ways and thinking about the work of social change in pretty different ways.
Yeah. And you mentioned it earlier. You tapped into like social entrepreneurship, whatnot. Some people call it different things, but I think that's really a great way to summarize it. Um, do you think that that's pretty much the next iteration of this sector, that it has to adopt that kind of entrepreneur? I'm skipping ahead a little bit on the questions, but now that you mentioned, I agree with you that the sector is broken and it's not getting any better. So even if you improve upon the current framework, it's still not going to get the job done. There's supposed to be a pretty big shift that needs to happen. Do you find like social entrepreneurship is an umbrella that can encompass that type of shift?
I don't really. I think there's a lot of excitement around social entrepreneurship, and I think there's particularly in recent years been a lot of excitement around social profit organizations, or
Hmm.
organizations that have a double bottom line. So
Yeah.
they're seeking to make a profit, but they're also seeking social change. And I think that's absolutely great. And I'm excited. When those organizations enter the marketplace, I think they have a unique value to add. But I'm not at all advocating that the nonprofit sector needs to become completely like social entrepreneurs.
Hmm.
I think the nonprofit sector exists to remedy disequilibrium that's been caused by a market economy.
Hmm.
So we will always need to subsidize efforts that the market just can't handle, and so you're never going to be able to completely replace the nonprofit sector with for-profit social change organizations. So instead, what I advocate is, okay, let's take a hard look at the nonprofit sector and let's see if we can you know tap into those enormous things that the nonprofit sector has to offer: tremendous passion, a long history of creating social change. Social change wasn't invented 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Social change has been going on for a long, 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 long time. And the nonprofit sector has led that charge for, a really long time. What I'm saying is there are some structural problems within the nonprofit sector that need to be addressed. We need to channel more money to social change efforts. We need to release the shackles, the charity shackles that the nonprofit sector operates
What do
under.
you, what do you mean by that? With the charity shackles, because that's an interesting
Yeah,
phrase. I want our audience members to kind of
yeah.
be elaborated on.
Well, so let's keep in mind that the nonprofit sector was born out of, this movement for philanthropy,
Hmm.
hundreds of years ago, and there are still remnants of ways that we think about the work of nonprofits. So a lot of times in America, we sort of talk about the nonprofit sector as a living beside the economy. It's not an
Yeah.
integral part of the economy, or we talk about fundraising as it's sort of an approach that's a begging approach, where we're begging
Hmm.
for money to support these critical efforts. And in essence, we look at the nonprofit sector as a charity, and I hate that word. It's not just semantics, but it's this idea that the nonprofit sector isn't good enough. It's not as critical as the business or for-profit sector or the government sector. And again, it lives beside the economy, and I think that's just really a wrong approach. We all desperately need the solutions that the nonprofit sector is offering, and so we need, again, to change these structural challenges, so that nonprofits can do more of the work, of solving these social challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, so in my mind, when I hear the term charity as well, it does kind of make me cringe a bit. Um, and I find that a lot of times when we think about giving to nonprofits or fundraising nonprofits, I
Mhm,
find it's almost like putting a band-aid on a gaping wound.
mhm,
And for that's the thing. When you mentioned also the social change origins, um, in the extent that it's broken, isn't it not the fact that the big part of the reasons why that the sector is breaking down is because ultimately the origins is practical human behavior. If you're going to a begging posture when it comes to fundraising, that's natural that people will tend to kind of pull back a little bit. Um, what's the big aha moment that directors and board of directors need to have to even open the lid on having this new look on what the
Yeah.
nonprofit sector could be? Because it
Yeah.
seems like it's a mindset first.
Mhm.
Then the solutions start to come through, and then you
Yes.
can execute. What's the big barriers that keeps
Yes.
nonprofit leaders from taking this new approach or mindset rather?
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree with you that you have to start first with shifting mindsets, and so that I do that. I do a lot of that work with nonprofit staffs and boards is to just encourage them to start thinking in new ways. And so, one very tangible way I talk about this is this idea of financing instead of fundraising your nonprofit
Mm,
organization. So, fundraising is activity that's just sort of, again, beating your head against the wall, throwing gala events or sending out
yeah.
direct mail pieces or begging the board to go ask their friends for money. Those are all inefficient and sidelined activities. Instead, you want to create an overall financial model for the social change you seek. And so that involves thinking about how are all the different ways we can or should bring revenue in the door that integrates with our mission and our core competencies. So if you're creating a robust financial model, you're thinking about money as a tool. So how do we, so instead of, I think a very sort of charity mindset is to be afraid of money, not want to talk about it. The board
Exactly.
doesn't want to talk about it. The staff doesn't, they hate it. They hire a development director, send them on their way and hope, they don't see them
Yep.
ever. And
Yeah.
as opposed to embracing money. Money is an incredibly important tool in social change. And so, if you want to attract enough and the right kinds of money to do your work, you have to embrace that. And you have to create an overall financial model to do that. And essentially, it's a strategic plan for money for your organization. And it's completely aligned with your programmatic goals and strategies. And so once you do that, and you get board and staff on board with that, get everyone involved in the financial models. You no longer have board members that say, oh, I just do programs, I don't do money,
Hmm.
which is completely ridiculous. Then you really start to create that financial model. You create that robust sustainability that's going to help you actually achieve your goals and achieve your mission.
Yeah. Uh, then you use this term again, fundraising versus financing. I just see a pattern that every time, you know, we talk about improving upon the methods that create social change. Um, I have the feeling that it's always dipping into the for-profit sectors, models, or lingo. And not to say that it has to borrow everything, obviously, but the reason why I tend to go with the entrepreneurial emphasis is that there's a big parallel between like a startup who is bootstrapping things, who are trying to get things off the ground, versus a nonprofit who's struggling and they have to be very savvy with their money and very conservative with their money. And
Mhm.
then in time they kind of grow up for that model. And you're mentioning financing is a big part. Using that term financing, it has a different connotation and associations attached to it. But also get other people financially literate and get them
Mhm.
all on the same page. Is that not what needs to happen?
Absolutely. So, board and staff and their funders need to
Everybody.
understand the financial model of the organization and how it's going to directly contribute to the social change you seek. And so, again, instead of thinking about money and
Hmm.
fundraising over here on the side and the real work of the organization over here with mission and programs, you need to integrate the two and make sure that money is contributing to and is fully baked in to the model and the work of the organization.
Yeah, I want to take a moment here to really highlight this because our our audience members need to hear this. It's not, oh, I'm just good at this, and for me, it's X, Y, and Z, and I'm good at this and that.
Mhm.
Everyone has to be bought into this process in terms of coming up with these financial models and getting financially literate in this area from the top down.
Yep.
Directors need to be a little more open with this information and how they allocate these funds. And
Mhm.
board of directors, I mean, you let me know now if this is true or not. is it impossible to have the improvements that are needed without having a board who understands this one critical piece that everyone on the board needs to be on the same page with the financial piece?
Yes, I absolutely think everyone on the board needs to be on board with the financial model. They have to help develop it, and then they have to help execute on it in order for you to turn your nonprofit organization into a long-term sustainable entity that's actually creating social change.
Yeah, and I think the convenience taking the shift brings from turning things from fundraising to financing is that it takes away this idea that it's one-off big productions that you have to have,
Mhm,
and you usually thinking about it as a one-time thing and part of the seasonal calendar, but
mhm.
really it comes to a 1 year to 3 year
Yes.
plan that's all
Yeah.
integrated. One of the benefits I find when nonprofit leaders take this approach is they start to see the illustration of systems theory and systems thinking, that it's actually a lot of pieces are part of this, and it really causes them to examine: do we really need this software, or whatever the case may be, and looking at the impact versus the finance that you invest. Where can people learn more about, you know, uh, getting better in this area? Because I find a lot of the people that we interface with have this being a really big struggle, and it's not like they want to run and hide from it, although some do.
Mhm.
It's just that they don't know where to begin. It's so overwhelming. There's so many. There's four different types of accounting. Where's a good start for these nonprofit leaders to kind of just begin in this
Mhm.
area of financing versus fundraising?
Well, I think the first piece is to change the mindset to get over this idea that money is scary or dirty or to
Hmm.
be feared or
Yeah.
dismissed or talked about. And so, I would send people obviously to my blog because I talk about
Yeah.
it all the time. But how to kind of get over this, how to have conversations with your board. I think one of the first steps is to just at an upcoming board meeting to just start having this conversation. So just ask the board, what do you think about this? Or, what about this kind of approach? How does that make you, how do you think we could adopt something like that in our organization? What might that look like? In terms of financial literacy, I think there's all kinds of tools, both online and, in most cities, there are nonprofit capacity building organizations that have workshops and classes on how to read a nonprofit financial statement, how to
Hmm.
increase the financial literacy of your board of directors. Local colleges and universities often have, kind of accounting 101 or financial statement 101
Yeah.
classes and things like that. There's all kinds of books, financing for dummies, nonprofit financing for dummies, all of those sorts of things. So you don't have to become an
Yeah.
accountant or, incredibly talented at this sort of thing. And you can also, as a nonprofit organization, rely on the finance committee of your board, which often can be made up of financial advisors or other people in the financial community that can help bring that kind of expertise and can help the rest of the board gain some of these skills. But I think honestly, the thing that holds people back the most is not the acquisition of knowledge, financial knowledge. It's really that fear. They
Hmm.
don't even want to talk about money or approach it because they feel like it detracts from the programs, the mission work of the organization. And I would say actually it doesn't detract. In fact, it does the complete opposite. It makes you more effective
Yeah.
at creating that change.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think the mindset is the biggest one, and second to that is the lack of clarity. So definitely surrounding yourself with those tools and resources. Just this past week, John, the co-founder of PanVisio, and I did another podcast where we're talking about um, there's different ways to acquire this knowledge. There's one way is to going back to school for that master's or second master's, and then there's just reading books on the topic. What's in between for a busy nonprofit professional? Go back to that episode if you want to learn more about how that we mentioned, like lynda.com, or there's obviously YouTube channels that are dedicated to these things. And now I know you have something on your webpage for an ebook or something like that that you can
Yeah,
um,
I have webinars, tools, guides, ebooks,
yeah.
all kinds
So there's a lot, the big fear for a lot of people is, I don't have time. I don't have time for this. Well, that's not an excuse anymore. The need is so great. If you can't get a degree, that's fine. If you don't have time to sit down and read a book because you have so many hats you're wearing and you have family life and all that stuff, it's just as simple as scheduling a couple webinars, every once a month or whatnot, and really go from there. Thanks so much, Nell, for that. Wanted to kind of take it into a little deeper dive. Okay, the financial piece is, I think, foundational, critical. If without that, everything else kind of gets rough to accomplish. What are some of the biggest, I guess, battle scars you've had in the area of nonprofit consulting? I mean, consulting is a rough position because you're not in the organization, you're not completely out either. You're right there in between. What's some of the biggest lessons that you've had to learn in consulting?
Yeah, so I think the where I've had the biggest challenges are when a nonprofit leader and or their board say they want change,
Mm,
but they don't. At the end of the day, they don't actually want change.
mm,
So they can be attracted to the ideas that I'm offering. Let's create financial sustainability. Let's create a strategic direction. Let's talk about the long-term roadmap. Let's build a better, more effective board. That all sounds great on paper, but when it comes down to you're going to have to change your leadership style. You're going to have to,
yeah,
have some really difficult conversations with board members that aren't performing. You're going to have to, manage your staff in different ways. You're going to have to go ask for money in different ways. Sometimes, and this doesn't happen very often, but sometimes that those kinds of changes are hard,
oh
are
yeah,
really hard for people to embrace. And so, where I think that it falters is when people aren't honest with themselves about how much they are willing to change.
mm. You ever have to fire any clients?
I wouldn't say fire any clients, but there comes a point at which I think we both realize, it's not a good partnership
Yeah.
if what I'm offering is not something you're actually willing to do, then they need to find someone else.
Yeah, yeah, and it's tough because you only have so much time that you can spend, kind of, because you want to be, empathetic
Yeah.
and meet them where they are and coach them
Oh, yeah.
up.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So if
It's hard.
any,
I mean, what I'm advocating, I don't want it all to give the impression that this stuff is easy. It's
yeah,
not.
I
It's
agree.
really hard. And, I talk about leadership all the time on the blog. Leadership is really,
Yeah, absolutely.
really challenging. You have to have hard conversations. You have to make unpopular decisions. You have to do the hard work. It's not easy at all. And so when I work with my clients, I'm not at all saying, hey, this is what you do, go have at it.
Yeah,
I think, and I honestly, I think nonprofit leaders need a lot more support and training and coaching to be able to make these kinds of changes.
yeah, yeah, and it's tough when it's not there in terms of the physical element, having people literally around them to help them with
Yes.
this.
Yes.
So that's why again, I really lean on the webinars, the
Mhm.
remote. That is kind of we were working through Skype on this. Um, Do you, here's my hunch, and I do this sometimes when I have my Facebook rants that sometimes I have to like really be careful with. But one element they need to support, definitely more support, more encouragement, and inspiration. On the flip side, do we have to really, like you said, be honest and call people out on this? If you truly want this social change that you speak of, then you almost like give tough love. Is there any times where you had to kind of do that in your experience, and how's that been for you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think when I write the blog, a lot of times it's tough love.
That's where it kind of seeps out,
That's
huh?
that's where it comes out. Yeah,
Yeah.
sometimes it's cathartic for me to
Uh
actually write a blog post.
huh.
But it's tough love. I mean, I love the organizations and the people that I
Yeah.
work with. I have enormous respect for these nonprofit leaders. They see some sort of problem or challenge in the world. They create this organization that's all about, solving that need or creating the solution. I mean, that just tremendous passion and drive and entrepreneurialism and all of these amazing, amazing qualities. But yeah, sometimes, at the same time, they have to hear that, the way you're thinking about things or the way you're approaching your board or the way you're talking to your funders is not conducive to the work
Yeah.
that you want to do. And so you've got to change those conversations. You've got to change your own sort of preconceived notions about your organization, about yourself as a leader, about social change overall. And so, yeah, I guess I think I offer a combination of that sort of tough approach, but also
Yeah.
that enormous respect for the work that they're doing.
Yeah, I often have my wife take a look at my blogs to make sure I'm not going too hard on one side or the other. But sometimes I just can't help it. But yeah, no, I agree, and it comes out of a love. It is truly a tough love when it does come out. But um, and I often cite this phrase like it's better to be effective than to be right all the time. You can be right in anything you do, is be factual. But to
Mhm.
really get to the results, you need to be effective. And it's incredibly like I'm over and over. I see this happen over again. It's often the small things
Mhm.
that make the big difference in terms of your tone, the way you script that email,
Mhm.
and it kind of there's a thin line between. And I'm interested to get your take on this. There's a thin line between leadership and communication and sales.
Mm.
And the way you have to frame it to get the buy-in, there's a big, huge parallel. I think um, that is something that isn't talked about enough. I guess the communication side of things, and how oftentimes you have to think like a salesman
Mhm.
to get the buy-in.
Mhm.
Any thoughts on that and that whole prospect?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, at the end of the day, right, you're trying to sell your mission. You're trying to
Bingo.
sell your theory of change, or the way you think the world should be different. You're trying to sell that to the clients you work with. You're trying to sell that to your staff and to your board. You're trying to sell it to your donors and funders. And so, absolutely. I mean, I talk all the time about creating a case for investment and
Hmm.
creating a theory of change, which is articulating, because I think oftentimes for nonprofit leaders, it's so obvious to them why they do the work that they do. It's
Exactly.
so internalized. And it may be true for their staff. It may be true for some of their board members too. It's obvious. It's like a no-brainer why we do this work. It's a no-brainer why we created this organization. But for people outside of that world and that circle, it isn't. And so you have to articulate in a compelling way why somebody should care, why they should invest, why they should get involved, why they should spend their time and their money, why you are the right solution, why this is a critical problem that needs to be addressed. All of those things you have to articulate in a compelling way. And so, yeah, I mean, that is a lot like sales. In this sense, though, you're selling something hopefully a lot better than, a widget. You're
Yeah, exactly.
selling
Or
change.
yeah, and I think just similar to that fundraising connotation and financing, I think the sales aspect, and again, here's this thread of borrowing from business models and infusing it in nonprofits
Yeah, but
is really tough. It's really tough. Go ahead.
yeah, I hold back on that though a bit. I mean, I do think some of what I talk about is borrowed from the private sector, but the way I view the three
Hmm.
sectors, private, nonprofit, and government, is they all have something unique to offer.
Yeah.
And I think we do better when there's a convergence of the three
Yes.
sectors. The for-profit sector could learn a lot from the nonprofit sector and from the government sector, about baking social change into the work that they do, and
Hmm.
that approach, that consensus building approach, and
Yeah.
a longer term trajectory, et
Yeah.
cetera. So all of that to say that no one has this figured out. No
Monopoly. Yeah.
sector knows how to do the work right.
Well, that's why I feel like the nonprofit sector is so intriguing, is because it has that unique opportunity. If you had to choose to build upon a foundation, I would choose a nonprofit foundation or a mission-based foundation, and then build those models and those things that will help them become more effective. I'd rather pick and choose on top of that foundation than to have like a business foundation and then be limited in that way. So it's interesting. I mean, there's pros and cons for that. Wanted to kind of shift gears a little bit here because we touched upon it a little bit. For profit versus nonprofit, and it being social, being having an eye for social change and mission change. What you mentioned, you're fine with that, but is there? When do you think you'll see the time where social entrepreneurship, having that double bottom line, will be a standard or a norm, if at all?
Um, I I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you define a norm. I think the number of social businesses is increasing, which is
Definitely.
great. But I think there eventually there will be some sort of a ceiling, because again, social change is for the most part about righting some sort of inequity that the market has created.
Hmm.
And so I think there's always going to be a majority of that work that has to be subsidized, that cannot
Hmm.
be, you can't sell products and services to be able to fully address
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
amount of social
Yeah, I
change
agree.
that's required. So, I absolutely think and hope that social businesses will continue to grow as long as they are creating enough social change to warrant it. I think the danger is that entities call themselves a social business, but at the end of the day, it's really more about profit
Yeah.
than the social change work. So when that's the case, then I think you need to rethink it. But I think it's exciting, the amount of energy and investment that's going into that whole realm.
Yeah, I think it also lends itself to experimentation for solutions too. A lot of these nonprofits that hold on to traditional models, how they incorporate and those things, it doesn't leave enough runway for them to kind of really try to find a new solution or innovate or whatever that looks like. I do feel like it's going to increase. My gut says that it's going to the point. It might be to the point where uh, eventually it will be just like you file under LLC or nonprofit, you'll find that S corp or B corp in between. It'll be a norm
Hmm.
eventually, and I'm really excited for that because again, there's nothing that can replace a nonprofit. And then in terms of just pure giving, pure service, without not really thinking about how that feeds a bottom line as the way it does for a traditional LLC or whatnot. But I do see it coming to the point where hopefully it will be a norm because the problems are becoming so complex
Hmm.
more than ever. Our economies are so intertwined,
Hmm.
and so that's why I've really. Have you heard of this thing called anchor systems or anchor institutions?
Hmm.
No. Well, it's a thing that I know. There's one company called U3 Ventures, pretty much has a team of real estate people in expertise in real estate, both commercial and um, uh, private and personal. And then you have people who are experienced in community organizing, and people kind of sprinkled in various institutions or partnership building with
Hmm.
like universities, businesses, that kind of thing. And their
Hmm.
whole goal is to take a macro level approach to social change or making a positive impact in that community. And even though it's a macro level, they really are looking to have a micro level impact by literally trying to get um, uh, businesses in the area bought into some type of um, mission, vision, long-term plan that usually expresses itself in economic change or having a positive economic impact. So usually the university sometimes takes the lead of being a hub on
Hmm.
that,
Hmm.
and people will come in and really try to see how can we leverage the university's resources, expertise to have that impact,
Hmm.
with whether it's community service projects and or internships within the community and keeping dollars there. I thought
Hmm.
that was really interesting. And I'm speaking to individuals and they're not hearing too much about anchor systems. So I have to do some more research on that and see what the origins were, if it's a brand new thing or just something that is just a new name for something that's been around for a while.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's something that for PanVisio we're really looking to integrate in the sense that a lot of nonprofits, because they're so busy doing their own thing,
Hmm.
they they often recreate the wheel or neglect or fail to enforce partnership with other nonprofits that have overlapping missions.
Hmm.
Do you see that often from your experience? And if so, what's one of the ways that can change?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about is the sort of insularity that occurs in nonprofit organizations, and I see it as a direct result of this competition that nonprofits feel
Mm,
because the sector is so undercapitalized, right? So if
mm,
we're all competing for funding with all of these other entities, then you set up this scenario where you kind of just want to keep your head down and
yeah.
try to keep going. But one of the things I advocate is what's called a networked approach, or an article came out several years ago in Stanford Social Innovation Review that I felt was just an incredibly seminal article called "The Networked Nonprofit,"
Hmm.
and it's this idea that, and it's been built on lots of different approaches over the years, but it's this idea that social change really happens through a networked approach as opposed to sort of an institutional approach. And so we need to
Mm.
think of our work not as building an organization, but
Upward, yeah.
really building a movement, or building sort of a
Uh-oh.
network of other people, entities, institutions, whatever they are, that are all working towards a similar social change goal. And creating those strategic alliances, creating those networks to be able to move that forward. And that's a pretty different approach than sort of a traditional nonprofit approach, where you keep your head down and try to make your fundraising budget and kind of move your individual mission forward. So I think it's really critical, and especially in this time of changing communications, and the way that we live
Yeah.
and work is quite different. And so I think you need both networks and institutions to really move social change forward. And so I encourage organizations to think in that more networked mindset.
Yeah. And I agree. And here's $1 million question. Can we have social change, whatever we define that as, can we have social change without a networked type approach? I mean, yeah, I mean, yes, that's the appeal for me is anchor institutions, is because in higher ed specifically, we interview folks who are interested in this in higher ed too, like multiple presidents of colleges and universities,
Mhm.
where we talk about this because nowhere in our society do we find the cross section of youth who are looking to kind of for something bigger to apply themselves to, expertise with professors and administrators, and then physical capital. The auditoriums, the
Mhm.
fields, the parking, all those things. Do we find in higher ed? So that's
Mhm.
what was so the light bulb went off, and then when I heard anchor systems, it kind of made sense.
Mhm.
Can we not have? I mean, the $1 million question is: can we not have social change without having this macro level approach?
Yeah, ultimately, I mean, that's why I talk so much about a theory of change. Because if you truly are a social change organization, if at the end of the day you're trying to create social change, you have to have a larger theory, and you have to understand how you fit into the larger
Exactly.
marketplace of other efforts, funding, needs, social problems, and how they evolve over time, other entities working on those social problems. You have to have that macro approach to really create change. So yeah, I think you have to have a much larger worldview
Yeah.
that change.
Yeah, and it's kind of like you said, it's hard with that competition with nonprofits. Again, and I know I'm probably beating down a dead horse here, but again, that's that whole thing with having that double bottom line, or being more social entrepreneurial in the sense that you want to fund your own initiatives, in the sense that you don't have to depend on that resources that you're competing for. You're kind of funneling your own resources.
Now, see,
That's
I disagree with that. I mean,
can you
startups
do? It's hard to do both.
startups have a really difficult time
Oh yeah,
assigning resources as well. And honestly, I would say social businesses almost have it worse,
yeah they
because
do.
they can't go to foundations, for example, for that startup capital, or growth capital. That's a whole money side that's just not open to them at all.
Yeah,
Social investors are a pretty small marketplace right
there
now, so
is.
that's not a huge funding stream for them as well. So I don't get into. There's a lot of these debates
Yeah.
around about social business versus nonprofit, and which is the best model for creating social change. I think that's bunk, and I think it's sort of a meaningless conversation to
Yeah.
have. Really, what we need to figure out is, for the social change you seek, seek what's the right financial model and structure to be able to do that. Maybe sometimes it's a social business, maybe sometimes it's a nonprofit or some sort of combination of the two. I don't know. Maybe it's government, who knows? But you as an entity have to really go through the process of figuring that out, what's right for what you're ultimately trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I agree that it's very specific to what you're trying to achieve in terms of what's right for you. I know for a lot of students that I work with at my current job, they are very interested in starting nonprofits and
Mhm.
whatnot, and they seem to get discouraged when they see the financial aspects of having to fundraise all the time and whatnot. So yeah, they have to have options. And one of the things that I appreciate about the whole social entrepreneurship side is the fact that, yeah, you're right, the space for that area is kind of limited, but then you have crowdfunding, and there's no particular earmark that you have to have on that. There's a little more flexibility with that kind of
It's
stuff.
unrestricted. It's unrestricted revenue.
Yeah.
Fine, though, it's crowdfunding is very sort of time specific. It's not
Hmm.
ongoing revenue. So
Yeah.
I always look at it as capital, right? Because it's a sort of a one-time infusion of
Correct.
significant money for something, pretty specific. So,
Yeah.
I don't know. But the larger point I would make, though, is it's not all up to nonprofits. And so, I sort of view my role in the work that I do as kind of playing on both sides. So I
Hmm.
talk a lot and work a lot with philanthropists and other funders as well, because we have to change these larger structural problems. It's not enough for nonprofit leaders to change their mindset and come up with a financing plan. At the same time, we
Yeah.
have to change how the sector is capitalized, the restrictions that we put on the sector, the structures that we force them into, the ways that we make them operate. For example, we put a lot of pressure on nonprofits to say that they can't be involved in any sort of political maneuvering,
That's
can't
huge.
advocate, can't, so um, that's a huge problem, right?
Very
Because
big.
ultimately, if a nonprofit organization is wanting significant social change, at the end of the day, they have to
Yes.
work to change those underlying political and regulatory systems. So
Exactly.
that involves advocating. So we have to change not only nonprofit leaders, but we have to change the larger systems and the way policymakers view the sector and what the sector can do, the way funders fund the sector. There's a lot of change that needs to happen.
Yeah, so you mentioned on your blog that that's a myth that you can't get political, and that's we interface with, like, again, a lot of higher ed programs. One of them being an educational opportunity program. So students who can't afford college but have a good, have a lot of academic potential. There's a state program that allows them access and gives them certain funds should they pass a summer bridge program, a pre-freshman summer bridge program. They just got cut some funding, so a big chunk, and that's a pattern across the country. Higher ed is getting cuts again, even more so than usual. Um, what's some of the myths in the area of politics or political advocacy that you feel like is important to pop?
hmm Well, so I think the majority of nonprofit leaders and board members think that nonprofits cannot get involved in any kind of advocacy or political work whatsoever, and that actually is not the case. Um, as I understand it, the only restriction is that nonprofit organizations cannot specifically
For
support
candidates,
a
right?
candidate.
Yeah.
Correct. But they can talk to lawmakers about
Hmm.
policies that are going to impact their clients or impact the work and the social change that they're working towards. They can hire a lobbyist. They can do different things. And so, what I encourage nonprofits to do is to dig in and really figure out what they can and cannot do, and then tell their board about that. Get their board, get their donors, get their supporters, their volunteers, even their clients involved in a larger advocacy movement for the entity. Again, if you're really wanting system change, if you're
Exactly.
really wanting larger social change, it's not enough to just address the current needs of your client population. If you want to ultimately, at the end of the day, make those needs disappear, then you have to look at larger activities that can move that agenda forward.
Yeah, and that means, and going back to the systems theory or systems practice of being very uh, aware of all the moving parts,
Mhm.
you're saying that you have to allocate time and resources and make this part of the natural operations, day to day or month to month or whatever it is. But um, isn't that what it takes? Because I see like when people do advocacy, it's like last minute.
Mhm.
Let pull let call let ring the alarm and
Mhm.
get everybody on board. When really it should be an ongoing thing, and the director and or the board should be more keeping their ear attuned to those legislative policies, updates, those conversations.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, it depends on the organization's larger strategy. So again, it goes back to a theory of change. So
mhm,
I always talk
yeah,
about how a theory of change is a fundamental building block to any organization's strategy and strategic plan. So you have to figure out, first of all, what's your end goal? What are you ultimately trying to
yeah,
accomplish? Then let's figure out the strategies to get there. Advocacy may or may not be one of the correct strategies to work towards an organization's long term theory of change. If it is a strategy that makes sense, then absolutely you've got to put resources and people behind it. Otherwise, that strategy will not come to fruition. But it's got to be thoughtful. And so I also talk a lot about nonprofit organizations, how they have to move from a reactive to a strategic
exactly.
approach to everything that they do. So the reactive approach is to say, "Oh, we should probably be doing some advocacy. Let's just, get up to the hill and talk to some people," as opposed to, "Wait a second. How is it part of our long-term strategy? What are the specific activities we should be doing? Who should we be talking to? What should we be talking to them about? What are we ultimately trying to get them to do differently?" So it's much more of a strategic approach as opposed to just sort of, putting out fires and reacting to a need you may
So,
see.
what would that look like? Because it's very timely for a lot of our listeners now. What would that look like to be more proactive? Would it be submitting a proposal and saying no to your budget? Here's something you should consider instead. What would that look like being proactive in the area of advocacy?
So again, it goes back to your larger strategy and your theory of change. So if you are an organization that part of your theory of change is to see laws change,
Hmm.
then you absolutely have to have an advocacy arm. So you've got to have people up there talking to lawmakers on a regular basis.
Regular basis. That's big.
Yeah, helping them to craft the language of new laws, what it might look like, educating them on what the issues are and what their approach should be. All of those sorts of things, getting your board and donors and volunteers involved, if that makes sense. So again, there's no right
Yeah.
answer for every organization. It goes back to your theory of change and your overall strategy. What are you trying to accomplish? Who are the actors that you need to influence to create that change? Then what are your strategies for getting those actors to behave differently?
Yeah, I think that's where, for particularly our audience, we tend to work with smaller or to mid-sized nonprofits, specifically for those who are addressing family needs or the youth in the area of education.
Mhm.
Excuse me. And so we find that it's not enough to be reactionary, like you said. One of the things we do, or at least encourage our organizations to do, against more so in the education piece, is the finding the players by name, because oftentimes we know the issue, we know the cause, and we
Mhm.
know what to complain about, but they can't specifically find and target that one person who hinges in terms of
Mm.
influence. So
Yep.
that's huge, targeting and going from there. And then just encouraging, if you know your clients, and this is not, again, it's not going to apply like you said to every single one, but if you know your clients, if you have a good relationship where they reside by zip code, there's some things they do that you can encourage to give them information on who they can call
Mhm.
for representatives. That's always tends to be very effective, and making it busy proof or
Mhm.
lazy proof even for them
Yeah,
to really just pick up the phone and
that's right.
do it. So crafting that language. So that's definitely huge. To wrap things up, I wanted to kind of ask you, more of a practical day to day thing. When it comes to nonprofits managing their projects, managing their to do lists, their schedules. What are some of the big things? Because a lot of times we're talking about macro level. I often find that nonprofit leaders really have a hard time with the productivities 101 and how to set up their things and manage their teams. How do you personally strategically set up your calendar? What do you use for your to-do list or productivity or anything like that?
Well, so I mean, I would say managing your time is not a challenge just for nonprofit leaders. I think it's a
It's
challenge
the
for all.
humans. Yeah.
It's a human challenge, and I
Yeah.
think it just gets worse and worse every year, honestly. I mean,
Yeah.
there are more things we're supposed to be doing right
Hmm.
now. We're supposed to be managing all of our dramatically increasing social media challenge, channels, and
Yeah.
all sorts of things that we have to be monitoring. And we live in this age of just an information glut, right? I mean,
Hmm.
there's just so much information being thrown at us all the time to sort of manage that. So, I mean, I think being really clear about what you're trying to accomplish as a nonprofit leader and as an organization has to be really your North Star for the work that you do. So always sort of going back to, and I think at the end of the day, it does boil down to being more strategic. If you know what you're ultimately trying to accomplish, if that is your guiding principle for the organization, and you have a strategic plan that you're moving forward on, and you're aligning things to that, then when other things come up, you can filter against that plan and that larger strategy, and really focus your effort, and also take the time to just check out of that information glut, and to just sort of return to, what am I trying to accomplish? How do I focus my efforts? I think it's just absolutely critical. Just turning it off on
Yeah.
a regular basis, getting back to that quiet and that space where you can think about, as a leader, okay, here's all the data. What's the right way
Hmm.
forward?
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of Tim Ferriss and some of his approaches. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he talks about in his book the 80-20 rule. What's
Hmm.
the top things that you can get out of in terms of your production, your outcomes? What's the top 20% that yields 80% of the results?
Right.
Focusing on that. He even talks about, like, what similar to what you said, a information fast. Sometimes
Hmm.
you do need to break away.
Yep.
But on our blog at PanVisio, we break down some of the ways. It's almost like a pyramid,
Hmm.
where you have your mission and vision on top.
Hmm.
From there, you have your yearly goals or 3-year
Yep.
goals. You break that down in a calendar of
Yep.
quarterly milestones. Then break that
Yep.
down. Now, that's all fine, but the practical side, and I don't know if this might interest you, is putting it on a shared operations calendar that
Hmm.
everyone can see what the milestones are, when the deadlines
Yep.
are, and then from there, use a shared productivity system. I know people are usually operating on their sticky notes or a
Hmm.
notepad. Having a software that actually is shared project management could be very powerful.
And I don't even think it has to be that advanced.
Mhm.
When I work with organizations to create a strategic plan, we operationalize the goals and objectives. So we create an annual plan, and we put it up on Google Docs,
Yeah,
often, so that
yeah,
everyone can access it. You don't have to worry about version control. Everyone can see, what am I supposed to be doing this month or this week, and how does it fit into the larger plan that we have, and how do we need to change it going forward. So I don't think you need any kind of fancy tool. I think there are things out there that just can help you manage your team and manage towards your larger strategy.
yeah. And the whole piece of using software. I don't know if you know this, but Google for Nonprofits. Have you heard of that? Right? It's
Mhm.
free. It's
Yeah.
free, and it gives you increased storage for those things,
Hmm.
for those documents, and unlimited email accounts, which is pretty nice.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So definitely check that out. We'll put a link to Google for Nonprofits to kind of they have the best document sharing around.
Yeah. Agree.
That's huge big. Before we let you go, I know you mentioned on your blog just not too long ago about the performance imperative.
Hmm.
Can you share a little bit about that, and where people can go to find that, and also where they can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am part of a group of national nonprofit thought leaders called the Leap Ambassador Community, and it came out of Mario Moreno's book, The Leap of Reason, where
Hmm.
he encouraged the nonprofit sector to move towards outcomes. So to move to a place that is answering the question, to what end? Why are we doing this work? What's our
Yeah.
ultimate goal? And how do we measure if we're actually achieving that goal? So this Leap Ambassador community spent the last year putting together a very clear definition of what a high performance nonprofit organization looks like. And we created 7 pillars that sort sort of define a high performance nonprofit, and that's called the Performance Imperative. And I talk about it on my blog. There's a whole website devoted to it. What is a high performance nonprofit? How can you move towards becoming one? And we're really hopeful that this sort of sets the North Star, the gold standard for the nonprofit sector to move to a place where we are much more high performing, more sustainable, and ultimately creating more lasting social change.
Yeah, and I think what's so great about that it puts a name to what we define as excellence
Mm-hmm.
and creates like a baby step system, and the different elements that tie it all together. Because that's when you talk about social change and being excellent at that. Where do you begin? So
Right.
that's so great that it's like piecemealing it together for all together there. So we'll have that linked to the show notes as well. And of course, they can find your ebooks, your products, and your blog where?
At socialvelocity.net.
Okay, so we find you there. Are you on Twitter at all, or?
I am, yeah, at Nedgington.
Oh, okay, at Nell Edgington. So follow her there. I know I will be. Your blogs are great. I get it in my email, and I'm always looking out for it. So thanks so much for that.
Yes,
Thanks so much now for kind of breaking down some of the history and some of the macro level things, but also giving some practical advice too. So that's Nell
absolutely.
Edgington at socialvelocity.net. Can we have you on again sometime in the future?
Yes, absolutely. I enjoyed talking with you.
All
Thanks for
right,
having
likewise. Thank you. Thanks. Have a good
me.
one.
You too.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.